The subject tonight, and again, I've always said that I've always found the lectures that are someone's personal life story to be the most powerful of them all. Because we relate to the stories, we relate to someone's journey, to their own discoveries in life, and we put ourselves many a times in those shoes and trying to connect and see the parallels of people's lives, of how we journey through life together. And when I read Mark's bio and the write-up about his talk tonight, it's interesting, how many of you here, by raise of hands, are children of Holocaust survivors? And in many of our circumstances, at least for myself and I've read for Mark, is our parents, in my case it was my father, in Mark's case it was both his father and mother, didn't talk much about it. It was the unknown. I mean, we knew they were Holocaust survivors. We knew that they had a family that we never met. So I've always known the name of my grandfather and grandmother that were murdered by Hitler and even all of my father's sisters, I didn't really know their names until way later in life. His brother's name, perhaps I knew. But there was so little of what I actually knew and was always afraid to ask. It was like that untouchable place where you just did not go. Yet you were curious. You wanted to know. So you would try to ask, in my case, my older siblings, do you know anything more? And it was only till my father's last years of his life that he really did open up and talk a great deal about his life and how he survived and how he was the only survivor and who his uncles were and aunts were. And he actually agreed to be videotaped a few years before his passing for something for us to see after his passing. So for us to get that history. So I could relate to a little bit of what that's like to discover when they're no longer here so much about their lives. Mark's story, and I'm not going to tell it to you, I'm going to let Mark tell it to you because I'm sure he does a far better job, is intriguing, and that there's so much details to it. It's in fact been published in a book, and it's called Schindler's Listed. The books will be available for sale after the lecture, and the author, Mark, will sign the books for you. So I'm going to allow Mark to tell his own story, ladies and gentlemen. Please welcome jointly Dr. Mark Biederman.
How's this? Do I have to hold, or can everybody?
You can leave it.
Try to get this a little.
So you're a little taller.
All right. How's that? Can everybody hear?
Yes.
Okay. Now you're kind of falling asleep there, so I'm going to try to keep you awake there. I mean, I get it. You know, it's late. You know, it happens. You know what? Anyway. So I'm going to talk about my story, about my journey of discovery, about my parents, because they never told me anything. Everything I had to do on my own. I could never get them to speak about anything. So I was born in a suburb of Detroit called Oak Park. It was a predominantly Jewish suburb. But even though it was predominantly Jewish, I was the only kid in our neighborhood of immigrant parents. And I knew beside the fact that my parents spoke funny with their accents, I knew there was something not quite right about them. I couldn't place it. I never knew what it was, but I'm like, they're just different. And I started to put it all together around my 6th birthday. I remember my mother made me a birthday party, a neighborhood party, like all the other mothers made for their American kids. You know, my mother tried to give me the American experience. But my birthday party was different than all my friends. All my friends had grandparents, aunts, uncles, cousins there. I had nobody, just my parents, my brother, and a few friends. I remember asking my mother, like, gee, where are my grandparents? Where are my aunts? Where are my uncles? It's like, oh, you don't have any of those people. They were all killed by the Germans. I'm like, killed by the Germans? I'm like, why would anybody want to kill grandparents, aunts, uncles? I'm like, you're kidding me, right? This is a surprise party. They're going to come out of the closet or something. But no, there was no such luck. So when I realized that they were all gone, I was pretty upset. I'm like, I can't believe they're all gone, killed. I'm like, not only are they missing, but they gave the best presents, especially grandparents. I always gave the most expensive presents. I didn't get any of that. So I'm pretty upset, and I'm like, okay, I don't get what happened, but I go on with my life, and not long after, I'm grocery shopping with my mother, and I used to love to go grocery shopping because number one is I'd make sure she would feed us from all 4 food groups, right? Candy bars, cookies, ice cream, bubble gum. But then I'd also schlep all the change. So one day we're shopping and we get the change, and I get a Mercury head dime in the change. Everybody remember the Mercury head dime? Right? For those who don't know, that was the official American dime from, I believe, 1912 to 1945. It went out of mint when Roosevelt died in 45, and it was replaced by the Roosevelt dime that we have today. But occasionally in the 60s, you'd still see the odd one floating around. So I got his change as this 1916 dime. And I'm like, wow, I'm rich. I was all excited. My father was an electrician. I'm like, I can't wait till my dad gets home, show him this thing, and show him how rich I am. He's going to be all proud of me. So my father gets home from work, and he sometimes wasn't in the greatest of moods. He ran his own electrical business. Things were tough running a business. Plus, he had some post-traumatic stress issues being a Holocaust survivor. So I show him the coin. I'm like, look what I got, Dad, a Mercury head dime. I'm a millionaire. Well, I want to start collecting these. He's like, don't bother me with that nonsense. He says, we had a coin collection in our backyard in Poland that we had to leave behind when the Germans took away our home. I'm like, Germans, wait, those guys again. I mean, who are these Germans? Those are the guys that killed all the grandparents and uncles. I'm like, talk to me. Who are the Germans? They're like, you're not ready. We'll talk about it when you're older. And in fact, that was the line up until my father died. It was like, we'll talk about it when you're older. So I don't know when that day ever comes that you're old enough. But it never came because unfortunately, my father never lived long enough to tell me anything. So anyway, I'm all upset. I'm like, talk about this dime. Talk about the Germans. What do you mean by coins? Wouldn't say anything. So I'm kind of upset, and I go to school a couple of days later. I'm like, teacher, who are the Germans? They've killed all my family. They've taken away homes. Who are the Germans? What happened? And the teacher says, go look up Holocaust in the dictionary. So I'm like, all right. So I go to the school library. I take out the Webster's dictionary. I look up Holocaust, and the only thing it said in the definition was total destruction by fire. And I had no idea what that meant or how that related to my parents, but I'm like, okay, this sounds like something that I should learn. So from probably 10 years old on, I started taking out every book with the title Holocaust in it, reading every novel, every newspaper article, magazine, watch every TV show, documentary. So for years I was reading, I became quite knowledgeable, quite what I considered an expert on the Holocaust. But I knew nothing about my father's own family or my mother's. It was always wait till you're older. And they would never speak. So fast forward a few years, I'm a freshman at Michigan State University. Hang on a second, let me just get these slides ready. So I'm a freshman at Michigan State University, and my father dies of pancreatic cancer. And my mother says, you know what, I can't handle the home anymore. Your father's gone, it's too big, you're away at school, your brother's away. I want to sell the family home. So I'm like, all right, go for it. I'm away. I get it. So she sells the home, and we're packing up to move, and I'm cleaning out my father's nightstand, and I find these pictures. Can we turn the lights down a little bit here?
Is that a light switch right there?
No, it's a little more complicated.
Okay. How's that? Okay.
You want to keep it that way, switch it back on?
I'm okay.
Don't fall asleep here in the front, okay?
So anyway, so back to that. So I'm cleaning out my father's nightstand, preparing for the move, and I find these pictures. I find this, I find this, I find this, and a couple of drawings. And I'm like, Mom, what is this? What's going on here? What are these drawings? She goes, oh, your father was an aspiring art student before the war, and after the war, in his spare time before you were born, he liked to draw. I'm like, well, that's a pretty dark sense of drawing. I said, what does that represent? She didn't know. I said, okay, and who are these weird people that he's got pictures of? What are these pictures all about? He says, oh, that's him and his 3 sisters. I'm like, wow, I didn't know Dad had sisters. I'm like, you're kidding me. He had sisters all this time I never knew. I said, what happened to him? She says, they were all killed by the Germans. I'm like, yeah, I mean, I know, but I mean, how, what? She says, I don't know. I'm like, I said, this is a terrible thing. I said, I have no idea. These people are gone. Dad's gone. I said, I started to go pretty regularly to synagogue, and I used to observe the yurtzeit boards with everybody's family. I'm like, everybody has some memories of their family. I know nothing. I don't know who these people are. I don't know their names. I said, I want to find out what happened to him. And I said, Mom, you got to start talking to me. I said, what happens if you pass away? Then I won't know anything there. So surprisingly, my mother produced a picture of her family that I've also never seen before. And she told me everything that happened to her family, and we'll discuss my mother at the end. But surprisingly, both my parents luckily had pictures from before the war because they sent these pictures to relatives that lived overseas, and they were able to retrieve them after the war. A lot of survivors left with nothing. They left the camps with just the rags on their back. They had nothing to remember. So my mother tells me all the story about her family, and then I turning back to Dad, I'm like, so you know nothing? She's like, nothing. I'm like, by the way, I said, I remember that coin story when I found that Mercury head dime years ago. I said, did Dad ever mention anything about any coins that his family buried? She said, oh yeah, he mentioned that after the war, he went back to his hometown to try to dig up the coins that his family buried. But there was a Pole living in the house. Your father went with one of his friends. The Pole had a gun. And when he saw the two boys walking around the yard, he shot at them. Said he killed your father's friend. Said your father ran away and never went back. So the coins are still there. She's like, no, nonsense, the coins aren't there. I'm like, yeah, no, they're still there. She goes, no. She says, the Poles dug up every inch of ground when the Jews left. There's nothing left. Don't be crazy. Don't be Meshiga. I'm like, no, I think the coins are there, Mom. I said, and I'm going to find them. I said, not only going to find them, I'm going to find out everything that happened to Dad's family, because I need to know. I said, I might want to make a yahrzeit plaque. I said, I got to know all this stuff. She says, you'll never find this out. How are you going to find out? I said, well, there's got to be records. I said, what town was Dad from? I said, I'm sure there's some kind of records, birth certificates. I said, I'll get records and I'll start from there. She says, don't make yourself Meshiga. There's no records. The Germans destroyed everything. You're not going to find anything. And I'm like, I don't think so. I said, the Germans in their Wannsee conference made public to the world that they were going to kill all 11 million Jews of Europe. I said, if they're going to seek out and find all 11 million Jews, they obviously didn't destroy the records. I said, quite the contrary, they needed the records. I said, the records are there and I'm going to find them. She says, you're Meshiga. I said, I know that, but I'm still going to find all this stuff. Excuse me. So she says, how are you going to start? I said, well, what hometown was Dad from? I said, we'll start getting the birth certificates and we'll go from there. She says, I don't know, he's from some little shitty town in Poland, excuse the language. She says, I think it was called Krosno. I said, how do you spell it? She said, it's a C, with a C, or maybe with a K. So I'm like, all right. She says, if you can't find Krosno, look for Jaslo. It's another shitty town right next door. So I'm like, all right, how do you spell Jaslo? She says, I don't know. It's with an I or a J. So I'm like, all right. So this is 1980s, by the way. This is well before the internet and your ability to go on computers. So I go to the library and I grab a Polish atlas. I skim down the C's, the I's, the J's, the K's. And I found a little city called Krosno, Krosno. So I copy the information, and as I do some more research, I was able to find a vital records office with an address. So I bring the information home, and I'm like, Mom, does this look like the city? She's like, I don't know, is Jaslo next door? And I'm like, as a matter of fact, yes, there was a Jaslo. She says, yeah, that's the place. So I'm like, good, help me write some letters in Polish. I spoke a little bit of Polish. My parents would never let me learn Polish. She's like, it's an evil people, an evil language, you don't need to know it. But anyway, so with my rudimentary Polish and hers help, I wrote some letters to the Vital Records Office, in Krosno. And I said, could you send me any birth certificates for the family Biederman from, say, 1900 to 1925, as I figured about the age range of the people we're interested in. So I get no response. So another couple weeks go by, I wrote another letter, no response. Finally, after about 3 letters, I wrote a 4th one. I'm like, Mom, I'm going to give him one last try. I put a $20 bill in the letter. And I said, I'll be glad to include more if there's a cost for these records. So my mother said, you don't send them a dime. She said, they're not going to give you any information anyway. They hate you because you're a Jew. I said, well, how do they know I'm a Jew from letters? She says, they have radar. They have a sixth sense. They know. Don't send them a thing. I did, and I got no response. I'm like, okay. So finally I said, I'm going to try something else. So I came up with a cockamamie story. I wrote to the Polish embassy in Washington. And I said I applied for a veterinary internship at the Warsaw Zoo, and they accepted me, but they only accept Polish citizens. And I said, I can do this because if my father's a born Pole, I could get citizenship with his birth certificate. So I said, look, I really want to do this internship. Send me, get me some information on Harry Biederman. Can you get me a birth certificate? I got nothing, no response at all. So finally, I'm like, you know what? I'm not getting anywhere with letters. I said, I just got to go in person. So I'm in Chicago one weekend. I was at a football game to see Michigan State play Northwestern. I don't know if anybody's familiar with Northwestern back in the Midwest. It's a pretty prestigious university. So it's in Chicago or near Chicago. So I'm at a football game. So I make an appointment to go. There's a Polish consulate. So I make an appointment to go to the Polish consulate in Chicago to get a visa to travel to Krosno. This was, mind you, before the fall of the Soviet Union. You had to get a visa to travel there to Poland. It was still behind the Iron Curtain. So I make an appointment with the woman. I make a visa appointment. I come in and sit with her, and she's like, what do you want to go to Krosno for? I said, well, I think my father was from there. I need some records. I need to get a birth certificate. I want to go to vet school. I threw in any kind of BS I could think of for a reason I need a birth certificate. And she says, do you have any family in Krosno? I'm like, no. She goes, well, what happened to them? I said, they were all killed in the war. She said, were they Jewish? I'm like, yes. She goes, oh, okay, your visa's denied. I'm like, denied? Why is it denied? She says, well, if you don't have any family there and nobody to visit, we don't want you traipsing around Poland unattended, so you're denied. So I'm like, man, I don't know where to go from here. So I start saying, let me try to do some research and try to find out, other channels. I wrote to Israeli embassies. I tried to see if they could help me. I got nowhere. For years, I got nowhere. I didn't know what to do. Finally, in 1991, the Soviet Union collapses. Poland opens up to the West, and you could travel without a visa. I'm like, this is great. So I'm trying to find travel mates to go to Krosno. I asked my mother, and she's like, you're not going to Poland over my dead body. You could go when I'm dead. I'm like, I don't know when that's going to be, but I said, I want to go. So I asked friends, relatives. I didn't have any relatives. I asked friends, my brother, like, yeah, you're crazy. No, I'm not going over some stupid wild goose chase. Everybody was like, same thing I got from everyone. It's a stupid goose chase to think that there's coins, that if you're going to find anything. So finally I meet my future wife, beautiful wife, Randy. And I said, and I tell her this story. I said, I think I know where there's some buried coins in a backyard in Poland. She says, I know a travel agent. Let's go. What are you waiting for? So we book a trip to travel to Krosno. And before we leave, we buy a metal detector. I bought one of those little metal detectors that you see guys on the beach with. I mean, this is going to be a piece of cake. So we fly to Germany and we drive into Poland. We stop and visit at Auschwitz where my mother was. And I got to tell you, driving in Poland is a nightmare. I mean, the signs are all misdirected. If you're trying to find Auschwitz, it'll tell you it's left and it's right. If you want to go to Krakow, which where my mother was from, it'll tell you to go left and it's right. So we finally made it to Krakow, and we toured my mother's hometown. But Krosno is very rural and on the far eastern side of Poland. I'm like, you know what? This is the urban part, and I can't find where I'm going. I'll never be able to do Krosno by myself. So we hire a guide. And it's funny because I'm looking through guides and I'm calling them all, and every guide had the same line. He's like, oh, I was Schindler's personal valet for Schindler's. I was Spielberg's personal valet for the filming of Schindler's List. I drove him around. I'm an expert tour guide. I'm this and that. Call the next guy, gives me the same story. So, all right. So I selected the guy that sounded most legit. He seemed pretty legit. So we decided to go to Krosno. Unfortunately, while I'm waiting for him to arrive, I'm reading the pamphlet about the ground-penetrating radar detector. I'm like, this is going to be a piece of cake. So I'm reading the pamphlet, and it says they only have a range of 1 inch. So I'm like, all right, this is worthless. So I throw it in the garbage, and my wife's like, what are you doing? I'm like, this thing's worthless for our purposes. I said, if coins are there, they're much, much deeper. So anyway, so we go with the guide and we go to the city hall. So my goal is to try to find records, but also an address of where these coins might be buried in their yard in Poland. So we go to Krosno. We show up at the city hall, and I got to tell you, Krosno is like a 700-year-old medieval city. that probably hasn't had an ounce of maintenance in those 700 years. It reeked, it was moldy. So we find the city hall. I walked in, and there's two women sitting behind an information kiosk. I walk up to them. I said, "Do you know where I could find the vital records and birth certificates from, say, 1900 to 1925?" And the woman says to me, "We don't have any records. They were destroyed by the Germans." And the other woman says, "They're Jewish. Don't tell them anything." So I said, "What do you mean destroyed by the Germans?" She said, "We don't have nothing. The Germans destroyed everything. Go home." So I'm like, "Oh my God, is this the reception we're getting here?" So I'm walking out. I'm really disappointed. And we walk by a little stairway that's going to the basement, and it says archives. So I'm like, I said, "You don't need your help." So I go down the basement, and there's a woman sitting behind a glass enclosure. It says, "Fill out the last name of the people you need your records," and there's a file card sitting there, and hand it to the clerk. So I write Biederman on the file card. I hand it through the glass enclosure to the woman. She looks at it, looks at me, crumbles it up, throws it in the garbage. I'm like, "What's going on here?" And she just turns her back. I'm like, "Oh my God." So the guy goes, "Don't worry." He says, we'll do something else. He said, "Why don't we try the main post office and see if they got postal records? Maybe we can get an address of a home." So we go to the post office. I'm like, "I'm going to try a different tact. I'm not going to be so direct this time." So I go in and I said, "My father was a proud Pole. He loved Krosno. This is such a beautiful city." I said, "Give me 10 stamps of every denomination you got. They're so beautiful." So I buy about $500 worth of Polish stamps. And I said, "By the way," I said, "my father was, I believe, from Krosno, but I'm trying to find an address. I want to visit his hometown or his home. Do you have any postal records or archives from, say, the 30s? So the woman says, "Hold on." She walks away, comes back with a close sign and hangs it on the window, and then shuts the blinds. I'm like, "What is going on here?" So our guide says, "Listen," he says, "here's the story." He says, "The Poles recognize that you're probably Jewish. This was probably a town that was mostly Jewish, and they're afraid that guys like you are coming back to reclaim homes and properties and businesses, and they don't want to lose anything. So it's not that they hate Jews, it's not that they're anti-Semitic, but they just don't want you to come in and claim their home and property, so they're not going to give you any information that's going to help you." He says, "But I got a great idea." He said, "Why don't we find the old Jewish section?" And said, "Walk around and find some of the oldest people in town and see if they knew the Biedermans." I'm like, "Great idea. No wonder I'm paying you all this money." So we go and find the old Jewish section of Krosno, and we're walking around, and I'm showing those pictures like the ones I had previously of my father's family, and I'm like, "Does anybody know the Biedermans? Does anybody remember the Biedermans from before the war?" Nothing. I just get dirty looks. Nobody would even look at me. Finally, there's an old guy sitting on a bench on a corner with a white cane. He's like, shaking his cane around. And he's like, "Let me see those pictures." So I show him the pictures, and he's looking up in the light. He's like, he says, "My vision's gone, my memory's gone, but for $100, I'll show you where these people live." I'm like, no, thanks. That's okay. I don't think you can help us. So we're all dejected. We're leaving Krosno, and our guide says, "You know what?" He says, "We really haven't established that there was any Biedermans here." He said, "I think on the way to the car we passed the old Jewish cemetery." He said, "Let's go in and see if there's any tombstones that say anything about Biederman, see what we can find." I'm like, "Great idea." So we walk by the old Jewish cemetery, and we go in there, and we couldn't read anything. I mean, what vandalism hasn't destroyed, which was pretty bad, nature had. The stones were all tipped over, worn out. You couldn't read anything. So it was a complete bust. We didn't get any information. But later I find out that I was actually walking over the area where my father's mother and 2 older sisters were buried in a mass grave. But I didn't know it at that time. So we're dejected. We leave Krosno. It's total bust. We don't get anywhere. So I said, Randy, I said, if we're going to do this, we got to be much better prepared. We've got to come up with addresses and do this beforehand and come up with a better plan. We can't just come empty-handed. So we go home, and in the meantime, 2 big things happen. The movie Schindler's List comes out on DVD, and the internet comes online. And along with the internet and Schindler's List, there was a huge interest in Jewish genealogy, and there was a website came available called jewishgen.com. And what the website did is allowed researchers for certain towns to link with survivors from those towns. So I entered looking for survivors from Krosno that knew a Harry Biederman. And I entered it into the website, and I'm waiting for a response. And in between, while I'm waiting for a response, I'm working on a horse one day. I was a horse veterinarian in Windsor outside of Detroit. I'm from Detroit, but I set up my practice in Canada. It was a much more thriving horse business, horse community. So I'm working on a horse one day, and out of a blue, a horse trainer says to me, "Hey, was your father on Schindler's List?" And I had seen the movie many times, and I had seen the DVD many times. I'm like, not that I know of. I mean, he died 13 years before the movie came out. I said, "Why do you ask?" He says, "Oh, I was watching the special features, and I seen a Harry Biederman, or Hirsch Biederman was the third name on the list." So I'm like, "Really?" I said, "I had seen the movie. I'd seen the special features. I was always interested in Schindler's List because it took place in Krakow, which was where my mother was from, and I kind of thought it was a little bit of my mother's story, even though she never made it to Schindler's factory. She was definitely a Krakow native." So I run home, and like the second internet search I ever do is Schindler's List, and sure enough, there's my father, the third guy on the list. That's his birthday. So I'm like, wow, this is great. I said, now, not only do I, have this amazing information, but I now got a list of 1,100 people that knew my dad. I said, I could really start getting things done with research. And I was able to actually contact quite a few of these people. So anyway, a few days go by, and not longer, I get a response from my Jewish gender inquiry from a guy named Albert White in Arizona. He says, "I'm from Krosno." He says, "I think I knew a Harry Biederman in Krosno." He says, "Was your father, the Harry Biederman you're looking for, the one that was at the Krosno Air Base with me, the guy from Lodz?" I'm like, "From Lodz?" I said, "I don't know anything about Lodz." I said, "My mother said he was from Krosno." I said, "But the air base, that sounds familiar." Because, when I was a kid, I used to love and sit and watch World War II movies with my father. And we'd sit up all night and watch movies, especially in the summer. It was great when I was off from school. I used to like to sit up all night with him. And he always knew every plane. I had no idea how. Like, he'd always say, this movie's blah, so that's a Henkel from 44. This is a 1941 scene. That's incorrect. I had no idea how he knew all this stuff. I'm like, that's amazing. He was at an air base, of course. So I asked, but I didn't know anything about Lodz. I said to Albert, "How do you know about Lodz?" I said, what makes you think my father was from Lodz? He says, "Well, I'm from Krosno, and I know when he got to Krosno, he didn't know where his family was sent because they were sent separate. He was sent to the air base, and his family was sent to the ghetto, and he wanted to know where it was, so I'm sure he was from Lodz." So I said, "Oh, okay." I said, "How did he get from Lodz to Krosno? What were the circumstances?" Because I'm thinking, okay, where are these coins? What's going on? Now, I was busy looking for Krosno all these years. Maybe they're in Lodz. He says, "I don't know anything about how Jews got from Lodz to Krosno." He said, "There was quite a few Ludzers that I remember at the air base." He said, "In fact, I speak with a woman quite regularly." He says, "I talk to her a couple times a week." He says, "If you want, I'll call her and see if she knew your dad. Maybe she could provide you some information." So that's great. He said, "Her name's Clara Hirsch." So I'm like, okay. So he calls me back a couple days later. He says, "I got great news for you, Mark." He says, "Clara Hirsch knew your dad very well. In fact, she was present when his mother and two older sisters were shot. And she'd be glad to talk to you. She's going in for minor surgery this week. Call her in a week." So I'm like, this is great. I'm going to learn so much stuff. So I'm writing down all these questions that I'm going to ask Clara Hirsch. Like, I can't wait to find out all this information. I'm all excited. Week goes by. I call her. A guy answers the phone. I'm like, "Hi, can I speak to Clara?" He says, "Sorry, I can't help you. This is a Shiva house. My mother died last night." So I'm like, oh my God, you're kidding me. I mean, this is going like a nightmare. My timing is just horrible. So I'm like, okay, where do I go from here? So I had one bit of information. I said, this Clara Hirsch saw and witnessed my father's family shot. I said, so okay, what happened to the Jews of Krosno? So I do some research, and that was my goals. I wanted to know what happened to the Jews of Krosno and how Jews got from Lodz to Krosno to try to decide where these coins are. So I find out that Krosno, on August 10th, 1942, the Germans declared at the Wannsee Conference, which was in January, that they were going to kill all the Jews, the remaining Jews in the Third Reich. Till then, they were using them as slave labor. They didn't have the final solution in place till January. And Krosnow's turn came August 10th, 1942. So what they did is they summoned all the Jews to show up at the main market, and they took them all by train to Belzec death camp, and they gassed them immediately upon arrival. Now, Belzec death camp is the only camp that has no survivors. There was no associated labor camp with it. You showed up there, you were taken right to the gas chambers and gassed immediately. One guy escaped from the train before it stopped, and he's the only survivor of Belzec. So anyway, I found out that my father's father and youngest sister decided to separate from the mother and two oldest sisters to try to see if one of the others will survive. They knew that wherever they were going wasn't good, and they knew my father was still left behind at the air base. So the mother and two oldest sisters hid in the ghetto, in the Krosno ghetto. The father and youngest sister went to Belzec. They were taken immediately to the gas chambers, gassed upon arrival. Unfortunately, the mother and two oldest sisters were discovered in hiding in the ghetto. On the 10th, they were betrayed. They paid somebody to hide them. They were betrayed. They were taken to that cemetery that I showed earlier and shot and killed with all the other Jews that didn't show up at the marketplace that also hid in the ghetto. The unfortunate thing is the Jews from the air base were taken to dig the mass grave, and that's how Mrs. Hirsch was able to witness this event. And the question I don't know, and I'm not sure, is whether my father was also taken to dig this mass grave, and whether he also had to witness this. I'm not sure, and I don't know to this day because I never got to ask him. So anyway, so at least the funny thing is, though, the date was August 10th, 1942, that this happened. Murder of my father's entire family. My bar mitzvah was scheduled by my mother for August 10th, 1974. My father had nothing to do with the planning. He was busy running his electrical business. I just remember my mother did all the arrangements, and she told my father, she said, I'm planning the bar mitzvah for August 10th. And the only thing he said is, wow, that's such a horrible day. I had no idea why. He never elaborated. All he said was, I thought, he was a big horse racing guy. I thought maybe there was a big horse race on that day. I had no idea. He never said why it was horrible. I just remember when the day rolled around, he was in a terrible mood, drank really heavily, was totally drunk. When we left the party at night, on the Saturday night, he turned left onto a divided highway, onto the wrong side of a divided highway, 6-lane highway with a main highway in Detroit. We almost got killed. I'm like, oh no, I'm going to have my yurt site and bar mitzvah the same day. But luckily he was able to turn around, right the car, he made it home. But it's funny that I never knew what was bothering him on that day until 32 years later. I realized when I learned what happened to his family that it was the same day that his entire family was killed. So anyway, I now had a yurt site date, August 10th, 1942. Part of my goal was accomplished. I said, now I got to try to find where these coins are. How did Jews get from Lodz to Krosno? What's going on? Where are the coins? So I read that what happened was, in 1939, after the Germans conquered Poland, they divided their portion in half. The western half they annexed into Greater Germany, because it was Germany before World War I. It was given to Poland after the war. They annexed it, and their initial plan was to deport all the Jews to the eastern half. They called it the general government. And what they were going to do is put all the Jews to work as slave laborers and in military bases and factories to use for their upcoming attack on Russia. So that's why my father was sent to an air base. So I was actually able to find the deportation order that rounded up Jews and deported them to Lodz. And sure enough, my father was on there. Biederman, 5 names were sent. So I'm like, okay, so my parents were sent from Lodz to Krosno, or my father and his family. I said, so now I got to decide, are the coins there? But I said, in the meantime, now I know he's from Lodz. I said, now I got to start researching Lodz. Do I write letters to Lodz City Hall and start over with that? So I asked my mother, I'm like, Mom, see if you know in your Holocaust travels, you go to these conventions, if you could find any Jews from Lodz that might have known Dad. She said, what Lodz? He's from Krosno. I said, no. I think he's from Lodz. I said, I have pretty good evidence that he's from Lodz. And for my part, I wrote letters to there was an organization called the New Ludger Society. It was a group of Lodge Holocaust survivors, and they put out a newsletter. And I took out an ad saying, if anybody knew the Biedermans from Lodge, please contact me. I got no response. I for months got nothing. And finally one day my mother calls me. She's like, Mark, do you remember an Izzy Olivek? I'm like, no, I don't. I said, I know a Steve Olivek. He's a plumber. I used to see him on the jobs quite often with my father. My father's an electrician. In the summers when I used to go to work with him, I used to see this Steve. He goes, yeah, Izzy's his brother. She says, I'm in Florida. I met him at Wolfie's. I'm like, I said, how was Wolfie's? She says, it's horrible, always. The corned beef's horrible. Everything's, the bread's stale. It was horrific. She says, but I got some good news for you. She said, Izzy Olivek knew your father in Lodge. He wants you to call him. So I call him, and I sarcastically, I'm like, Izzy, what can you tell me? He says, what do you want to know? I said, is my father from Lodge? He's like, yes. I said, you don't happen to have an address by any chance, do you? He's like, yeah, he lived at 7 Zaglarska Street. I'm like, how do you know that? He's like, I lived at 9 and he lived at 7. We were neighbors. I'm like, you're kidding me. I said, your brother and my dad are they used to work together on the jobs. They never even spoke. Well, what's the reason? He's like, I don't know, and I don't know what went on, and I don't know why they never spoke. But anyway, so they were neighbors. So I'm all excited. I got this 7 Zaglarska Street, so I'm thinking, okay, is it still there? A lot of Polish cities were destroyed during the war. Streets were destroyed or gone, or some were renamed. So I call all the bookstores in the area. This was still kind of in the infancy of computer days, and I call them. I said, does anybody have a Lodge map? And I'm living in Windsor, Ontario, and I find in the suburb of Detroit, in Birmingham, there was one place that had a Lodge map. So I said, hold the map, I'll be right there. It was like a 30-mile drive from where I lived. He's like, dude, we don't have to hold it. He says, I don't think, He said, I don't think there's a flood on buying Lodge maps. He says, if you're getting here in half an hour, I think you're okay. So I run in there, I find the Lodge map, I buy it. I open it up, and I actually find Zaglarska Street. It's still there. I'm like, this is great. So I call my wife. I'm like, Randy, what are you doing? She's like, nothing. I'm like, sit down. I got some good news. I said, we're going on vacation. She's like, oh, I always wanted to go to Hawaii, right? I'm like, nah, not quite Hawaii. We're going to Lodge, Poland. She's like, oh, great. Thanks a lot. So we book a trip to Lodge, and before we leave, I go shopping. I like to get stuff for shopping, travel gear, whatever I needed. And we buy some travel guides. And it's funny because we open the travel guide and it says, under Lodge, it says, mention Lodge to any Pole and you're sure to elicit a groan. I'm like, oh, this should be fun. So anyway, what happened with Lodge was like a booming textile town in the early 1800s. But then when the Industrial Revolution happened throughout Europe and America, it never happened in Poland, so they fell well behind. They weren't able to produce any goods. And it went into complete decay since then, and it really, since 1820, has produced nothing. It's just basically a slum. So anyway, but interestingly enough, on the way out after buying this travel guide, on the dollar bookshelf, there's a book called The Trial of Adolf Eichmann. Does everybody know who Adolf Eichmann was? Do I have to explain, or does everybody know who he was?
We know.
So anyway, Adolf Eichmann, for those that don't know, he was considered the mastermind of the Holocaust. He was behind rounding up all the Jews. He was considered the most sinister guy. He was captured and taken to Israel for trial in 1961. In his defense, he said he was a minor official. He claimed all he did was schedule trains. He knew nothing of what they planned for the Jews and where they were going. They just told him to schedule the trains, and that's all he did. He didn't issue any orders whatsoever. In order to rebut this, the Israeli prosecutors presented an order. It was dated December 4th, 1939. It was the order sent to the Jews of Lodz to deport them to Krosno. And it said, you are ordered to appear at the main marketplace tomorrow. You can bring 10 kilograms of clothing per family and 10 kilograms of clothing per person and 300 zlotas cash per family. Failure to abide by this rule punishable by death, Adolf Eichmann. So the prosecutor said, look, here's an order that you said punishable by death. Did any Jews not show up? Were any killed? So he had to admit, and there was evidence that yes, Jews were shot for not obeying that order. So it was interesting in the book, but for me it was a huge piece of information because this was the deportation order that my parents got, or my father's family got, and it said they could bring 300 zlotas total, which is about $100. I'm like, if they have a valuable coin collection, they wouldn't bring it with them. I said, that's it. The coins are in Lodz. I said, now we just got to go to Lodz and find them. I'm all excited. I'm like, they're in Lodz. So we traveled to Lodz, and welcome to Lodz, Poland. This is on every corner.
Oh my God.
So after driving into the city and checking into our hotel, the wife hides under the bed. And she's like, we're not going anywhere in Lodz. We're going home. Turn around, take me out of this godforsaken place. I'm like, don't you want to see Zaglarska 7? She's like, no. I said, don't you want to dig some coins? She's like, no. I'm like, well, we're going to do it anyway. We came this far. So I finally coaxed her out of under the bed, and we go to see Zaglarska 7. I'm like, okay. I'm like, all right. I said, this obviously has not changed from before the war. I said, you can actually even see there's brick underneath this plaster. I'm like, this is the place. I was afraid there might be some new construction, a new apartment building, and then I figured the coins have long since been discovered or buried over. But I was really excited. The old place still seemed to be there. I don't think it's been changed. I'm like, the coins are here. I could feel it. I said, how do we find them? So my wife says, why don't you knock on the door and tell the owner that you're the son of the guy that lived here before the war? I'm like, yeah, right. What am I going to say? Hey, what if the same guy's there? I'm like, hey, I'm the guy that you shot and killed. My father and his friend were here. You shot and killed them 60 years ago. I'm here to dig your yard. I'm like, no, sorry, that's not going to work. So anyway, I said, I got to come up with a better plan or plan B. But these coins are here. In my mind, they're there somewhere. So I'm like, I just got to figure out how to find them. So my wife's like, okay, take me home. You're on your own. So we go back home, and I'm like, okay, how am I going to dig these coins? I'm like, what am I going to do? Anybody have any suggestions or ideas? No? Right? Okay. Because everybody's like, why don't you just buy the property? And I thought of that, but I'm figuring, if I buy it, if I offer to buy it, who would want this thing, right? So I'm obviously tipping them off that there's some value to the place. I'm like, that's not going to work. So I'm sitting up one night and watching TV, and we used to breed horses for a living, and during the breeding season, horses, when they foal, if they don't deliver their foal immediately, they could get into big problems. They have to break their water, and the foal has to be delivered in about half an hour. So once they break their water, you got to be right there, because if some problems are arising, if you don't correct them immediately, it's life-threatening. So I used to sit and watch them around their due date. I'd sit and watch the mares on a video monitor attached to our bedroom. But next to the video monitor, I'd have the TV on all night. So I always used to watch the History Channel. So on this one night, I'm watching a show called Underground Berlin. And it's about a bunch of researchers that were interested in finding old Nazi sites in Berlin buried under the rubble. So in this episode, they're walking around the parking lot with this instrument, looks like a lawnmower, and the show host says, what are you doing with that thing? They said, we're trying to find the exterior walls of Hitler's bunker. And this is a ground-penetrating radar, and we can find disturbances in the soil. So the show host asked him, well, how sensitive is that thing? And the guy says, we could find a knife or fork buried 4 feet deep with this thing. So I'm like, bingo. I said, that's what I need, a ground-penetrating radar. So I run over to my computer, I turn it on, I try to look up ground-penetrating radars where you could get them. And of course it's password protected, and only my wife knows the password. So I'm waking her up. I'm like, wake up, Randy, wake up. I said, I need the password to the computer. She's like, what for? I said, because I'm going to buy a ground-penetrating radar. She's like, it's 4 a.m. Go to bed. Are you out of your mind? So anyway, so she gives me the password, and I did look them up. And unfortunately, they weren't on sale at eBay. It's funny, now, they were about $200,000 back then. I'm like, okay, I obviously cannot afford a ground-penetrating radar to go on some wild goose chase. I don't know what's there. But it's funny, because after I wrote the book 15 years later, I actually did look up ground-penetrating radars. And today, you can actually buy one on eBay for about $10,000. But unfortunately, back then, you couldn't. So anyway, so I'm like, that's what I need, this ground-penetrating radar. How do I get it? So a few days later, I'm watching another documentary, waiting for another mare to foal, and there's a show about a guy named Yaron Svoret. Anybody ever hear of him? He's very well known. He's an ex-Israeli police captain, and he specializes in finding. He's now a journalist, and he specializes in uncovering lost and hidden Nazi treasure. And he's sponsored by major media companies. He's been on 60 Minutes. He's been on CNN. He's been on ABC. So I call him and tell him this story. I said, Yaron, I said, I think I know where there's a cache of coins buried in Poland. Are you interested? He says, you know what? Send me the information you have and the proof, and we'll go from there. So I send him everything I'm telling you about all my research, the story. He says, you know what? He says, I got to be in New York next week. He said, meet me at Fox TV, and we'll do a pitch to the president of Fox TV. He's an Israeli. He's a friend of mine. His name's Pierre Kafka. So I'm like, all right. So we make an appointment. We drive to New York. This was right after 9/11. My wife wouldn't get on a plane after that. So we drive to New York from Detroit. And we make an appointment, excuse me, to meet with this Pierre Kafka, the president of Fox News. Yaron Soiree is there. And he has an assistant sitting down, and I'm telling him the whole story. And he's really interested. The assistant's taking notes. He looks like really intense. And I finished the story, and he looks up at me. He's like, let me ask you a question. I'm like, yeah. He's like, what do you do for a living? I'm like, I'm a veterinarian. He says, can you make a living at it? I'm like, I'm doing okay. He's like, good. Go back and make a living, and don't bother me with this bubba masa. He says, every Jew I know has $1 million buried in their home in Poland, in the old country. He says, forget it. There's nothing there. You're not going to find anything. Don't bother me. So I said, well, I didn't say there's $1 million. I said, this is just the story. I said, I don't know. He's like, you don't know? I don't want to know. Goodbye. So we leave New York, and I get a call on my cell phone from Yaron Soiree. He's like, don't worry about Fox News. I got plan B. I got a better idea. I'm like, oh, God, what's your plan B? So I get home, and I get an email from him a couple weeks later. He says, here's what we're going to do. He says, we're going to go to Poland posing as film directors. He says, we're going to get all the proper documents, licenses to film. He says, we're going to scout the town. He says, we're going to stumble upon Zaglarska 7 as the perfect location to film a scene. He says, we'll put up a curtain saying, there's a nude scene here. It's a private set. He said, while we'll do that, he said, we'll dig for the coins, find them, and we'll have all the camera equipment. We'll be actually making the documentary. He said, then we'll have a documentary. We'll sell. We'll all be rich. Everybody goes home a winner. I'm like, great idea. Count me in. He's like, all right, send me a check for $200,000. I'm like, $200,000? I said, for what? He says, well, these things cost money. He said, this is going to be an independent film production. I said, I don't know if I got $200,000. I said, what happens if the coins aren't there? He says, don't worry, it's a great documentary anyway. He says, look at my friend Geraldo Rivera's documentary about the Al Capone safe. I'm like, yeah, that didn't do too well when you didn't find anything. He's like, yeah, no, it'll be great. I said, I'm not sure. Leave me alone with this. So I said, I'll have to get back to you. So I'm thinking about it. Do I want to invest this money? Is this guy a shyster? What's going on? So then I'm starting to think, you know what? Maybe my mother's right about this whole thing. Maybe the Poles did dig up every inch of ground. I said, and maybe I'm starting to think, if my father was with his friend and the friend was there and shot, did they have a shovel with them? Certainly they went to dig up coins. They must have had something to dig with. Did they drop a shovel? Did they run away? What were the circumstances? And plus, by them traipsing around the yard, they gave it away that they were looking for something. I'm like, yeah, the coins aren't there. Forget it. So I'm like, Yaron, I'm out. I said, I good luck to you, but I can't afford it. I don't want to afford it. I don't think any. So I forget it. I go about my business, and about 6 months later, I get a call from Yaron Soiree on a cell phone. He's like, hey, Mark. I'm like, yeah. He's like, I'm in Lodz, Poland, and there's all kinds of hoopla on his cell phone. He's like, I dug up your coins. I'm like, you're kidding me. He's like, no, I'm here with Fox News with Pierre Kafka, and we found your coins. He says, listen, I got to go. I'll talk to you later. He says, there's a Polish reporter wants to talk to you. So he gives the phone to a Polish reporter. And she says, yeah, I'm following the story. They came in and contacted us, Soiree at Fox, told us what's going on. He said, are you coming to Poland to claim your coins? I'm like, absolutely. So I hang up, and she gives me her phone number. She says, call me. We want to do a story on you, and we're going to go through the whole process of what happened. So I'm like, great. So I call my wife. I'm like, Randy, book me on the next flight to Lodz, and we're going to go to Lodz, and I'm going to find out what happened. And so I do that. I fly into Lodz. I meet the woman at the house. I end up flying into Warsaw. I take a train to Lodz. And those that read the book, there's kind of a funny incident that happened on the train. I'm sure somebody read the book, right? Remember the train incident? Okay. Good story? Okay. So anyway, I take the train to Lodz. I meet the woman at the Lodz train depot. We go to the house at Zaglarska 7, and she tells me what happened. What happened was, right around that time was also the 60th anniversary of the liberation of the Lodz ghetto. The Germans ended up abandoning their deportation plans, of which my father was the initial deportation. They didn't go well. The deportations had problems. So they decided they were just going to set up the slave labor right where they were, rather than deport them and try to find places for them. So Lodz was actually the first ghetto established. It lasted from 1942 till 1944. It was liberated. 2004 was the 60th anniversary of the liberation of the ghetto. So the Israelis sent a delegation of soldiers that were going to march the entire perimeter of the ghetto as a commemoration. And Svore and the Fox News went there under the auspices of covering this. But while they were there, they went to the mayor and said, hey, we know a story. A guy living back in Windsor tells me a story about coins at Zaglarska 7. Do you mind if we go and dig it up? So the mayor calls the necessary officials from the Treasury of Poland and the Department of Archaeology and Antiquities. And he says, you could go and dig, provided anything you find is property of the Polish government. So they agree. So they go out there and dig, and the Polish news follow them. It makes big media. So they actually hire a ground-penetrating radar company, actually this Underground Berlin that was actually in that show that we're digging up the Hitler's bunker, and they gridded out the yard, and they were going section to section with a ground penetrating radar. And like their first 3 times they hit like disturbances in the soil, and they dug and they found nails, they found junk, then they found like an old unexploded grenade from the war. And the mayor, when they pulled out this grenade, got all excited, had a heart attack. The mayor went there with him, had a heart attack, collapsed. So they actually schlepped the mayor away, and they continued to dig. The mayor's okay, he's fine. He was off for 6 months, recovering from a heart attack. And then I never met him, but I ended up meeting the deputy mayor, which we'll discuss. But he did survive, and he went on to be the mayor. I believe he's still the mayor today of Lodz. Anyway, so he had a heart attack. But anyway, on the final dig, they like all through the yard, they couldn't find anything. There was one little garden spot left, like right next to an alley. And the guy was growing some strawberries. Like, do you mind if we destroy your strawberry patch and run this thing over it? And he's like, well, I don't really want you. So anyway, so they coached him to doing it. And sure enough, they find a disturbance in the soil, 4 feet deep. They dig. Svore sticks a shovel and hits a ceramic teapot, cracks it, and all these gold coins come falling out. So he jumps up, waves to the crowd, and he's like, look what I found. And everybody's all excited. So the Minister of Antiquities goes, good, thank you very much. Collects all the coins, takes them to the Museum of Ethnography and Archaeology. So my Polish reporter goes, that's where we're going next. So we go in there, we go to this building, I'm led into the back room, and there's a big safe. They pull out the coins. There they are, that's me. So they put this loose leaf on the table with the coins all in the binder. I take the coins. I'm like, yeah, thank you very much. I'll be seeing you. So the guard steps in front of me. He's like, no, you're not going anywhere. He said, these coins are property of the Polish treasury. I said, what do you mean? They're my coins. They were found on my father's old property. He's like, no. He says, according to Polish law, he said, there's 3 things. He said, anything found in the ground is property of the Polish government. This goes back to the communism days where the ground was owned by the government. You own nothing. He says, what was found on top of the ground is a different story. But once you have to break ground, it's property of the Polish government. He said, second thing, Polish law says anything that's found that you claim was lost, your description had to match exactly what was found. I'm like, well, there's no way I can obviously do that because this was buried 20-some years before I was born. He's like, exactly, that's why you can't have them. He said, and the third thing is, there's no evidence and no records of any Biedermans ever living at Zaglarska 7 whatsoever. He said, so you can't have any access or any rights to these coins. So anyway, I forgot to mention, before I left, I got a call from the Israeli embassy. After the Polish newspaper reporter talked to me right before I left, I got a call from the Israeli embassy in Poland, and they said, before you go crazy in Poland, call us. So I leave the museum, and I said, well, rather than go crazy, I think it's time to call the Israeli embassy. So I called the Israeli embassy. I'm like, all right, what do you got for me? They said, listen, do a great service to the state of Israel. They said, Poland is trying to get on the UN Security Council. They were unsuccessful this year, but next year they're reapplying. They said, Israel needs all the help they could get in the UN. They said, be a nice guy. Don't make the Poles look bad. Tell them they're wonderful. They promised to build a Holocaust museum in Lodz, and these coins could be the feature. They said, think about it. Your family's story could be the feature of the Holocaust Museum of Lodz. Wouldn't that be great? I'm like, well, I think they would be better featured in my bedroom as a display, but I said, I'll think about it. So I leave Poland, and I'm like, all right, I'll decide what to do and go from there. So I said, we'll take it under advisement. So I get home from Poland. I left the coins there, and as soon as I get home from Poland, I get a call from a TV network in Canada called Global TV. They said, your story's been on Fox News, it's been on the BBC, it's been all over Canada, it's been all over the CBC. They said, we're really interested in the story. Will you go back and do a documentary? Go back with us to Lodz. I'm like, you're kidding me. They said, no, we can go in about a month. What's better than October in Lodz? I said, probably just about anything. But I agreed to be the good sport, and I agreed to go with them to Lodz for to film this documentary. So we go there, and the first thing the Canadian company schedules is a visit to the City Hall. So we go to the City Hall, and the deputy mayor runs out. The cameras are rolling. The deputy mayor runs out of the City Hall. She's like, oh, great to meet you. We love our Jewish residents of Lodz. She's like, there's a great Jewish renaissance going on in Lodz. There was one semi-kosher style restaurant, or kosher style, wasn't kosher. They said, there's Jewish restaurants in Lodz. This is a Jewish renaissance. Come travel to Lodz. So anyway, she goes, come on, let's go in. So she says, we got a banquet set up for you in the City Hall. So we go into the City Hall, and we go into the council chambers, and they got lox and bagels set out at breakfast. So I'm having the lox and bagels, and the mayor says, I've got a gift for you. The deputy mayor. The mayor was still off on heart attack leave. This was a woman, the deputy mayor. She says, I got a gift for you. So I'm like, the coins. She's going to give me the coins. So she puts an envelope on the table. She says, here's your gift. I'm like, what is it? She says, open it. So it is the birth certificate of my father from Lodz. I said, she says, isn't this more valuable than the coins? I'm like, why? And she says, well, with this, you can now become a Polish citizen. I'm like, what am I going to do with Polish citizenship? She goes, wouldn't it be an honor? I'm like, oh yeah, tremendous. Can hardly wait. So I said, you know what? I said, if you're, really generous, I said, I've been trying to find out information about my father's 3 sisters. Maybe you could find birth certificates for them also. And then I could finally find their names and birth dates, and I could really make a nice yurtsite plaque if I have their names. So she says, all right, I'll see what I could do. So we leave the City Hall, and then our next stop is the Polish Museum. So now this is the Holocaust Museum that they promised to build. So we go in there, and the Museum of Archaeology and Ethnography says Jewish Museum of Lodz, and there's just a little sign, looks like some hand-painted sign on a piece of paper. The guy took 2 minutes to make. So we go in, and the Jewish Museum of Lodz is about an 8x10 room with one picture, and it's the street scene of like the main street in Lodz during the ghetto times. That's all there is. There's no relics, no artifacts, and it's a really unimpressive picture because it shows the filth of the ghetto, and like the Jews are obviously in terrible shape, emaciated. So it kind of like a stereotype. This, what I thought was offensive because like, look how filthy the Jews are. They're sitting in the street in filth. And that was the museum. I'm like, well, where are the coins? Where's the monument to the Biedermans? What's going on? They said, oh, the coins are in another part of the museum. So we go to the other part of the museum, which was called Coins of the World. And there we go into Coins of the World Museum, and there are the coins set up in their splendor in a glass display case, all cleaned up, polished, shined. The ceramic teapot is expertly reconstructed, sitting there. And the sign over the coins said, these are the coins found by Polish researchers on an anonymous tip from a former resident of Lodz. It said it was with brilliant work that our Polish researchers uncovered these coins. owner unknown. I'm like, you're kidding me. I said, what happened with the tribute to my parents, nothing. Not a word about Biederman, nothing. So I left Poland pretty discouraged, pretty upset. And that's where we are today with the coins. They're still there, but I was pretty upset. But when I got home, I actually got the birth certificates of my father's 3 sisters, and I got the marriage license of my father's parents. So I was actually able to name the 3 sisters. My father's 2 oldest sisters were named Pesha and Sephora, and they were 29 and 28 years old on August 10th, 1942, when they were shot in the Krosno Cemetery, which I showed earlier. His mother was 58 years old when she was also shot in the Krosno Cemetery. Her name was Esther Malka. She was 58 years old when she was shot in the Krosno Cemetery. Her husband, my grandfather, was also 58. His name was Lipa. He was taken by train to Belzec on August 10th and killed with his youngest daughter, Sarah, who was 22, when she was gassed at Belzec death camp. They were killed, by the way, by diesel exhaust. Auschwitz was the first place to use Zyklon B. These earlier death camps before Auschwitz was built actually used diesel exhaust, which was much slower, much more agonizing. So anyway, this actually came, these birth certificates came on the 20th anniversary of the day my mother moved from her house to a condo after my father died. So it took me 20 years, but I was able to prove to my mother that I found the records I found the coins, I found the records, I found what happened to the sisters, I found the names, and that ended my father's tale. And now we'll talk about my mother real quick if we have time.
Yes.
Okay, so my mother's story is very interesting also. So while I was doing research and asking friends about my father's family, a woman in New York who was very close friends with my mother and father was also from Krakow, and I'm asking her about my father. She says, well, what about your mother's story? Your mother's story is better. I'm like, what about my mother's story? She says, your mother was born in Krakow. And my mother actually ended up confirming this later. She said her older brother was actually a big, strong boy hockey player, and he was taken to the Plaszow concentration camp where Geth was. Everybody's seen the movie Schindler's List, he said he was working, and there was a Jew fell while shoveling snow. He helped him up. He set his shovel down to help him up. The SS saw him helping another Jew, came by, hit him on the head, and killed him with a shovel. He was 17 years old, was killed in Plaszow concentration camp. My mother's youngest sister was taken in 1944. They evacuated all the kids 14 and under. They took them to Auschwitz and gassed them. That's actually portrayed in Schindler's List, the movie where you see all the kids taken away on the trucks. Does everybody remember that scene where they're playing the music and doing the health exams on the older Jews, and then the kids they take away? Geth made the rule, the commandant, that anybody 14 and older was gone. They didn't want any kids. That was May 14th, 1944. That was also my mother's sister's 14th birthday. And she was taken and gassed in Auschwitz on that day. My mother's father was a World War I veteran. He was hit by shrapnel in the foxholes, and he had shrapnel in his pleural cavity. He had recurrent pneumonias all through his life. During one of his bouts of pneumonia, he was taken to the infirmary in Plaszow when Geth, also portrayed in Schindler's List movie, ordered all the hospital patients killed. And this woman actually that I was speaking to was from Krakow, was a nurse before the war, and she was ordered to administer a phenol injection to the heart, which was a very common way they killed Jews during prisoners. You don't really hear much about it, but besides gassing, one of the most common ways was anesthetic injection, which stopped the heart immediately. So this woman had to do that to my mother's father in the infirmary. Anyway, so my mother and her mother survived until they closed Plaszow. They were sent to Auschwitz. My mother was kind of a young, spry woman. Her mother was not healthy. It was an older woman who had just lost her whole family. So Mengele, when he was at his selection stand, he sent my mother left to the camp, and he sent her mother right to the gas chambers. Well, my mother realized what was going on, and by this time she's like, I got nothing to lose. She ran over there, grabbed her mother, pulled her back into the line where she was going. So, the guards, they were mostly Ukrainians. The Germans were all mostly fighting at the front. The camps were mostly manned by Ukrainian prisoners of war. They were called Troniki. If anybody's ever heard that term. Anyway, so they beat them, separate them. My mother walks a few more steps, grabs her mother, pulls her back in the line of the living. So they start hitting them again. My mother's screaming like, I'm not letting go of my mother no matter what. You could shoot me here. Forget it. I'm not letting go of her. And it's starting to make a commotion. The Germans were very understaffed at the camps. They relied on confusion and speed and let everything happen right away before they knew what was going on. So everybody says, why did the Jews go like sheep to slaughter? Well, they really didn't. It was kind of a fast-paced, confusing thing. They really didn't know what was going on. A few did, like my mother, and she took the action, separated her mother. Anyway, so she's making this noise, and Mengele overhears my mother screaming from a few yards away, and he's afraid we're going to start a riot here that we're not going to be able to handle. So he goes up and looks at my mother. He's like, what's your problem, you bitch? And she says, well, I'm not leaving without my mother. And Mengele says, you're old enough to be weaned. And she's like, I don't care. And he looked at my mother, and he got kind of attracted to her. He says, listen. He said, you don't know how to cook by any chance, do you? So my mother says, yeah, we had a restaurant in Krakow before the war, a famous restaurant, which was total BS. She didn't know anything. I mean, if you would have ate the chazarai she made for me as a kid, it would have killed her meat. So he says, well, okay, I need cooks. So he said, so you two could cook for me. So he took my mother and her mother right to his kitchen, and they never entered Auschwitz. He told them, don't cut her hair, don't tattoo them. They shaved all the heads. And that's how my mother survived Auschwitz. She never went into the camp. And I'm like, I asked my mother, I'm like, Mom, this is what this woman said. Is this story true? She said, it's blah, blah, blah. So don't believe it. So I didn't know what to believe. And then about 3 years ago, I'm reading a book called Eyewitness Auschwitz. It was written by a Sonderkommando. Everybody know what a Sonderkommando was? They were like the biggest, strongest, starkest Jewish boys that were selected to work the gas chambers and empty out the bodies after they were killed. They were kept separate. They were fed well, kept separate from the entire camp population. Most of them were killed after 90 days and they replaced them. So very few survived. One guy did. He wrote a story, and in his book, he has this little paragraph about this crazy red-haired woman that refused to let go of his mother. And Mengele walked over, pulled the pistol on him, and he said for some reason this woman charmed him and he let him live. This beautiful redhead. So I'm like, Mom, is this you? And she says, maybe it is, maybe it isn't. So I still didn't know what to believe. So anyway, few years after my mother died, I was going through her belongings, and I found that she kept a file on all the sightings of Mengele. I'm like, why would she do this? And I've come to the conclusion that yes, that was my mother. And what happened was, after they captured Eichmann and brought him for trial, Eichmann went and, begged for his life with the Israeli prosecutor. He said, your Talmud says that you're not supposed to use the death penalty. If you can find, any reason you shouldn't use the death penalty, you should spare me. I'm a minor official. So the prosecutor said, okay, well, if you're such an expert in our Talmud, and I might be wrong on this, but I'm not a Talmudic scholar, but they told him, find one witness that could say something good about you, then maybe we won't kill you. So, of course, he couldn't, but obviously Mengele could, right? Because he saved my mother. And I believe my mother was afraid that if he was ever captured, he might have tried to call her as his one witness. I have no idea, but I had no idea why my mother kept this dossier on Mengele and all these sightings. But that's how my mother survived Auschwitz. And then, as it turns out, what this woman told me in New York, who's now passed, that he also told her to transfer when Auschwitz was closed and Mengele fled, to give her preferential treatment in Bergen-Belsen, send her the kitchen also. So my mother was able to survive Bergen-Belsen with her mother fairly well fed, and that's how she survived the war. A couple other things we got, and then we'll wind it up. Does everybody remember this scene from Schindler's List? Okay, so this guy is a rabbi, and it's not a fictitious character, it's an actual true character. His name is Rabbi Levertov. Whether the gun scene actually happened, I don't know. I'll give you a refresher. What happened was he was making hinges and the Commandant Geth, who was portrayed in the movie, came by and saw there was only like 3 hinges in his bucket. He's like, "How long you been working here?" He's like, "An hour." He's like, "All right, make me a hinge." And he can make a hinge in like 3 minutes. He's like, "Well, 1 hinge in 3 minutes, that's 9 minutes to make 3 hinges. What have you been doing for the other 50 minutes? And he's like, "Oh, the machine was broken. They put me somewhere else." He's like, "Not good enough story." So they took him out to shoot him. Well, his gun jammed, and then the adjutant's gun jammed. This is Geth in the movie portrayed. So anyway, this rabbi ended up surviving the war. He became chief rabbi of Krakow, and he ended up marrying my parents. This is my parents' ketubah. And this was handwritten by that Rabbi Levertov in Krakow. This is signed by 2 Schindler's List survivors as the witnesses. So it's an interesting piece of history. This is me in Krakow with my wife. This is my mother's picture again of her family. This is 1996, 1936, 60 years later. It took us all day to find that building in that location. I was showing this picture to everybody. I'm like, "Do you know where this building is?" And they're like, "No," but we ended up finding it. And one final thing, and then we'll call it quits. So my father was born in Lodz, was sent to the Krosno Air Base. From Krosno, he was taken to Plaszow, where he was selected to work at Schindler's factory. When Schindler's factory was relocated, he was moved to Schindler's factory in Brunlitz. This is where he was liberated after the war on May 6, 1945. I ended up finding a document which was on the cover of my book. It was my father's ID papers issued in August. They were issued from Mauthausen concentration camp by the Americans, August 1945. And one of the biggest puzzles to me is why my father, when he was liberated in May from Schindler's factory, why didn't he go back to Lodz? He ended up meeting my mother in Krakow and getting married in January. But what was he doing in Mauthausen in August? I have a couple theories, and one of my theories that I hope is true is as I did further research about Krosno and the Krosno Air Base and everybody in charge of the murder of the Jews of Krosno, they were all Linz area Nazis. They were all from Linz. So there's a lot of glorified stories about Jewish avengers and going there and killing some of the Nazis, and there was Nazis killed in Linz. And then the main Nazi that was responsible for the killing of the Jews in the general government area was named Globachnik, Odilo Globachnik. The rumor was he was about to be captured by the British and committed suicide near Linz. But other historians said, no, he didn't commit suicide. He was killed by Jewish avengers. So the good thing is my father was in the area, and I don't know whether my father was involved with Avengers, ended up killing some of the Nazis. I don't know if my father ended up avenging the death of his family. But I always say, if my father didn't avenge their blood, hopefully Hashem will avenge their blood. I think we say it, Hashem yinkam damam, may Hashem avenge their blood. And that's how I end my speech. Yes. We'll take questions in a minute. We'll turn on the lights. By the way, if there's anybody who wants any books, we have the books up front here. We could sign. Questions? Yes. Yes.
Whatever happened to Oscar Schindler? We don't hear much about that.
Well, I propose in the book, Oscar Schindler escaped to the American side, also went to Mauthausen, turned himself into the Americans, and then he was imprisoned by the Americans for a while. After the war, he stayed in West Germany. He tried some businesses, was unsuccessful. Then he went to South America, was unsuccessful in South America. All along, he kept in touch with survivors, and he was supported by survivors of his list. And he moved back to Germany in the 60s, died, I believe, in 1970 in Germany, and is buried in Jerusalem. But he was always supported by survivors. Yes?
What is the monetary value of the coins?
Well, it's hard to tell because I wasn't there when they were dug up. And unfortunately with coins, even if you have the date, and most of them are like 1700 to 1850 Dutch coins. Now I describe in the book why they were Dutch coins or why I think they were Dutch coins. But the list the Poles gave me says nothing about their condition. And coins, as you know, if anybody's into coin collecting, there's a huge range, like a 10-fold range, whether it's very badly worn or if it's near proof or uncirculated condition. There could be a 10 or 15-fold range. So to give you the date and mintage without the condition is difficult to tell. But if you take the lower range, assuming they were all very poor, badly worn, or you take the upper range, assuming they were all uncirculated or proof, it could be anywhere from 20 to 300,000. Yes.
I was responsible for digitizing hundreds and hundreds of the work ID records from Lodge. Every Jew who worked for one of the German industries in Lodge during the war was given an ID card, and it would give the photograph of the person, their signature, where they came from, their address, and what happened to them. So I don't know whether you were aware of that, but they are with Jewish gender, JRI Poland. So it's possible that some members of your family, instead of being killed or transported, worked at one of the German industries and was given an ID work card, because, as I said, I digitized all.
Right. It's possible. Now, of course, my father's immediate family wouldn't have been, because they were sent to Krosno before the Lodge ghetto was established.
Oh, okay.
Right. So there could have been other family members, but my mother insists that nobody from my father's family survived. She said there was one member that escaped to Russia. That as soon as because when they conquered Poland, the Russians took the eastern half, the Germans took the western half. And some Jews escaped to the Russian side. They were mostly sent to Siberia because the Russians didn't trust them either. So one of my father's relatives was sent to Siberia, and then he lost contact with them. So my father was always hoping one guy survived, but that's it. There was he knew everybody else in his family was killed. Yes?
What happened to your mother's mother?
My mother's mother actually survived. She died. She had a gallbladder rupture in a DP camp after the war. And she had emergency abdominal surgery and died of septic peritonitis. Gallstones are very common in starvation patients. So after all the starvation and all that, she developed gallstones, and then her gallbladder ruptured. And that even today is almost over 70% fatal if you get septic peritonitis. So unfortunately, they were like 2 weeks from coming to America. Had she had something like that happen in America, she might have survived with better conditions. I don't know. Any other questions? Yes?
Do you still have any way of trying to get the coins back? Are you still working on it, or is it over?
No, I still have some plans. It was funny because what happened was immediately after the story came out, I got contacted by ABC News. And they said, don't do anything with the coins. We want to follow the entire story. Don't get a lawyer. We'll pay for everything, all the expenses. We'll do everything. Just leave it to us. Don't do anything on your own. So I'm like, all right. And the guy was in contact back and forth with me for about 4 months and then never called me again. So I called him back. He was the vice president of international affairs at ABC. So when I called him back, I'm like, what's going on with the coins? He's like, oh, sorry. He says, I forgot to tell you. He says, I was hired by this new, young, dynamic presidential candidate to help on his campaign. I don't work for ABC anymore. Barack Obama. So that was it. So I still had some other plans, but I'm kind of waiting for networks, and, we keep telling the story, and hopefully somebody will want to produce something, or... I have talked to lawyers. I talk about it in the book, what the lawyer's advice was and all that also. Yes?
You don't think the Israeli government would have any interest in getting those coins into a museum in Israel?
I've asked them. They're kind of not interested at this point. They were insistent that I just make nice with the Poles, and that was it. Although today might be a different story, because Netanyahu isn't so interested about making nice with them. So we'll see. Yes?
I'm guessing it took your parents about 40 years, round number, to talk about the Holocaust.
Pardon me?
I'm guessing it took your parents about 40 years before they would say anything like
My father never. When my father died, he never said a thing. I never ever talked to my father about it. Not a word. Like we'd watch the war movies, and he would just watch the movies with me. But my mother finally opened up in about 2010, and she died in 2012.
In round numbers.
Yeah. Otherwise, she never spoke.
I want to thank Mark for joining us. Of the liberation of Auschwitz. I want to tell you, Mark, that you have done a tremendous honor to your family.
Good, thank you.
Researching, finding out their names, the dates of passing, a tremendous amount of work and tremendous honor that you've given your family to share it with us.
Good, thank you. Thank you.
Tell them again about the books.
Yeah, and the books.
The books are now in the lobby. You can bring it to Mark to sign. Mark will join you in the lobby to sign.
Thanks. It's hot in here.
That's why.